You've probably heard the recent story out of Boston Children's Hospital. Children with rare diseases who had gone undiagnosed for years despite having their genomes sequenced finally got answers after their data was run through OpenAI's O3 model. But in this explainer, we aren't going to look at this as some miracle story of AI defeating doctors. Not at all. Instead, we're going to reframe this as a massive human data bottleneck finally being exposed. We really need to rethink this because rare disease diagnosis is not simply a search problem. It's actually a high-dimensional, highly constrained causal path problem. To understand how we actually move from raw medical data to controlled medical intelligence, we're going to walk through 6 key areas: the human control bottleneck, the brute force illusion, diagnosis as energy flow, why failure is not final, governing medical AI data, and finally, controlled medical intelligence. Section 1, the human control bottleneck, and why highly resourced experts couldn't solve these cases.
The reality of modern medicine is that we've accumulated way more data than our human control systems can possibly process. Think about what a doctor is actually dealing with today. They're looking at incredibly high-dimensional evidence. We're talking subtle phenotypic symptoms, literally billions of base pairs from genome sequencing, complex family histories, daily lab results, imaging, prior negative tests, and an ocean of biomedical literature that expands every single day. The bottleneck here isn't a lack of medical knowledge or dedication from our doctors. The real issue is that the standard human diagnostic workflow just cannot continuously process this overwhelming stream of variables. Even the most elite diagnostic teams in the world can't hold every new gene-disease association in their heads while perfectly cross-referencing a patient's entire decades-long medical history. It's fundamentally a high-dimensional control problem.
Section 2, the brute force illusion. Why wide search is not controlled diagnosis.
So that brings us to a really critical question. Why isn't wide search enough? I mean, an AI reasoning model can evaluate genetic data, compare massive bodies of text, and scan unstructured symptoms vastly faster than any human team ever could. It can read those billions of base pairs in seconds. But relying on a model with that kind of unchecked brute force scale can actually be incredibly dangerous in a clinical setting.
The problem is that wide search, without strict discipline, produces plausible but completely false diagnostic narratives. A brute force AI can very easily overfit to a heavily researched famous gene, or it might confuse a similar-looking symptom with the actual causal mechanism. To put that into perspective, an AI might look at a patient with long limbs and aortic dilation and instantly generate a beautifully written, highly convincing argument for Marfan syndrome. But it might completely miss a subtle pathway distinction that actually points to Loeys syndrome. It generates a highly convincing sentence that is entirely wrong. In medicine, a plausible answer just isn't enough. We have to have auditable reasoning where the causal chain is testable, bounded, and clinically responsible. Section 3, diagnosis energy flow. Let's introduce the energetic paradigm, or EP. The energetic paradigm completely reframes how we look at diagnosis. Under EP, a disease is not just a text label to be searched for in some massive database. Instead, it's treated as a physical disturbance in an organized biological energy flow system. In this architecture, symptoms are just the visible outputs of hidden structural disturbances, and those disturbances must be methodically localized. Diagnosis becomes the strict stabilization of a causal path, rather than just asking a model to pull the most statistically likely disease name out of a hat. Under this system, every single candidate diagnosis generated by the AI must survive a strict 5-step causal chain. First, it has to prove exactly how a specific genomic variant alters a molecular pathway. Then, how that pathway disruption affects a specific tissue or organ system. Next, how that directly produces the patient's exact clinical phenotype. And finally, it must propose a concrete verification test. The system can't just casually link a gene to a symptom. It has to trace how, for instance, a specific genetic variant alters a cellular protein channel, which then disrupts electrical signaling in the cardiac muscle, which directly causes the patient's arrhythmia. The intelligence isn't allowed to just float freely. It is forced to map its energy path through these exact biological steps. Now, a major hurdle in AI medical diagnosis is having way too many candidate variants. A single whole genome sequence gives you millions of them. Instead of drowning a physician in hundreds of loose, theoretical possibilities, EP solves variant overload by ranking them strictly by their causal ability to transmit energy through that defined biological pathway. It prioritizes these structural control points based on how coherently they explain the actual clinical phenotype across the pathway and the organ layers. This is exactly how EP fixes those weak diagnostic narratives we talked about earlier. It applies strict deductive constraints. It completely stops the AI from telling convincing but false stories by forcing it to specify exactly what evidence is necessary to support a path, what specific evidence is currently missing, and what clinical conditions would falsify the claim entirely. It identifies exactly where each causal path gains evidence and precisely where it leaks certainty. Section 4. Failure is not final. Exploring the dormant assets of the medical archive. In traditional medical workflows, an enormous amount of value is lost because an unsolved case usually just gets shoved into an archive, leaving patients and their families in the dark, sometimes for decades. But with a failure state memory loop, unsolved cases are no longer dead files. They become preserved failure states. From day zero of an unsolved case, the system meticulously tracks all the failed paths. It remembers exactly which genes were checked, which hypotheses were rejected, and which phenotypic data was ambiguous. Then, let's say a year goes by, and new literature is published, or a new patient cluster is found, or a new verification assay is developed. That new information automatically triggers a case reactivation.
This persistent failure state memory is absolutely essential. It completely transforms static hospital archives into living, dynamic research engines. Rather than treating unresolved cases as passive storage where old negative results just disappear forever, EP functions as a full medical research architecture. It preserves these dormant assets so that patients are never forgotten, reawakening the diagnostic process the very moment relevant new data enters the global medical ecosystem.
Section 5. Governing medical AI data. The battle for clinical assets. Right now, without a framework like this, there is a massive data war unfolding in modern healthcare. On one side, hospitals hold the clinical evidence, the genomes, the phenotypes, the histories, and the labs. On the other side, technology firms hold the AI models and the massive compute power. EP elegantly solves this conflict by strictly separating this ecosystem into 4 distinct layers: data, model, control, and governance. The reasoning model doesn't get to control the evidence standard, and the hospital doesn't hide failed hypotheses. Most importantly, by strictly separating patient data governance from the AI reasoning engines, we guarantee that sensitive clinical assets never become raw, unregulated corporate fuel. And because doctors absolutely cannot, legally or ethically, trust opaque black box outputs from an AI, EP tackles the responsibility problem directly. Every single recommendation in this system carries a transparent audit ledger. This lineage tracks the provenance of the evidence, maps exactly what is driving the confidence score, and demands clear human decision checkpoints. The AI proposes and it ranks, but human doctors remain entirely responsible for clinical judgment, armed with the complete lineage of how a hypothesis was built. Section 6. Controlled medical intelligence. Outputting top-tier scientific research. The ultimate goal here goes way beyond treating just one isolated case. A true EP rare disease system is actually a comprehensive research engine. It outputs ranked causal hypotheses and guides expert verification through specific doctor review checkpoints. It organizes cohort definition, drives phenotype extraction, prioritizes variants, and structures uncertainty analysis. In the end, this transforms rare diseases from isolated, untracked anecdotes into structured patient cohorts that are backed by publishable evidence chains, generating top journal-grade scientific proof. As part of that highly controlled output, this architecture also solves the very real problem of over-testing and uncontrolled diagnostic toss. By identifying exactly where a causal path leaks energy, which is to say, exactly where the clinical evidence is weakest, EP chooses the optimal next verification test. This purposefully reduces clinical uncertainty for the lowest physical burden on the patient and the absolute highest clinical value. So to summarize our entire pipeline, AI provides the massive scale of space search, which is absolutely necessary to handle the modern data volume. But EP provides the indispensable clinical control layer required to keep patients safe. It builds out the causal diagnosis, the strict verification, the persistent failure memory, and the governed research, ensuring that our medical archives are active engines rather than passive storage. As our source material beautifully states, the true issue is that modern medicine has become a high-dimensional control problem. Data is abundant, but causal interpretation is scarce. Unresolved patients desperately need a living diagnostic system that can guide expert verification. The implementation of this EP architecture makes rare disease diagnosis so much faster, but never reckless. It makes human doctors stronger, giving them the exact tools they need to interpret vast amounts of data, ensuring they are deeply empowered, but ultimately never replaced. So as we move past the initial hype of AI in medicine, we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. Are we truly prepared to turn our dormant medical archives into living, controlled diagnostic intelligence? The framework to do this exists today, but it requires a very real shift from brute force search to disciplined causal reasoning. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this gives you a much clearer lens on the real future of AI in healthcare.